Welcome to The Property Planet, a podcast with Simon Howley and Amanda Perrotin of Bell Howley Perrotin, the show all about the tax and legal issues surrounding property ownership, where we discuss everything that affects property investors and developers and go deep into the details to unravel the advice, highlight the traps you can fall into and dispel the myths surrounding property ownership in the UK.
Good morning to all of our listeners and welcome to the Property Planet podcast. Of all the podcasts available, obviously we're really grateful that you're listening to ours today, not taking our audiences for granted, looking to constantly strive to bring you up to the minute content and experts, and of course today's no exception. We're very pleased to welcome back Patrick Cannon to the podcast today, discussing the impact of the budget, changes on SDLT. Obviously, we'll get into the detail of that shortly. Previously a practicing solicitor, former council member of the Chartered Institute of Taxation. Patrick's a tax barrister for civil and criminal disputes with HMRC. So good morning, Patrick, and welcome again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning to both of you. Nice to see you again.
Yes, and you. Obviously, the budget having come out last week. Thank you for coming on so quickly. But it's really good to get your views and opinions on the changes that were suggested last week in the budget. Not least of all, the abolition of the multi-dwelling relief. That's something that we see quite a lot of. And just reading generally, its intended purpose, why it was brought onto the statute books, and using that reason now for its abolition. Interested to hear your views.
Yes, well, thank you. I put a news item up on my website about the abolition last week, and just looking at that, I see that I referred to something called Cannon's First Law of Stamp Duty, and that is that a relief or exemption from tax will be withdrawn once ordinary taxpayers start to take advantage of it, thereby causing extra work for HMRC.
Yeah.
Now we'll come to the transitional cut-off date in a minute, but I was interested to look at the press release that was issued last week with the budget, because the announcement of the abolition of MDR referred to some external research that had been commissioned by HMRC, which justified the decision to abolish it. And I just had a flick through that, the references to the external research. I'm not aware that it's actually being published, but there's a reference to it in the press release. And they seem to have conducted or to have commissioned companies called IFF Research and an associated entity called Frontier. And it's interesting just to read, I think, the wording that HMRC have used in their press release. And it's pure Sir Humphrey. IFF Research adopted a multi-mode survey methodology, which yielded 2,162 surveys with MDR claimants. And then Frontier Economics carried out a scoping exercise to assess whether a robust econometric evaluation of the impact of MDR on key market outcomes could be conducted. Following the scoping, it was agreed that no robust economic or econometric analysis could take place within this contract. Frontier instead conducted a rapid, targeted, bracket, non-exhaustive, close bracket, literature review of the relationship. Sorry, I shouldn't giggle between transaction taxes and housing market outcomes, including house prices, transaction volumes, rental prices, and the number of rental properties. So enough. That gives you some idea of the basis on which the abolition of MDR has occurred. So make of that what you will. But it does seem that too many people were taking advantage of it and creating lots of work for HMRC. And of course, working from home these days, I think 80% of them work from home these days. That obviously was causing a great deal of inconvenience, particularly as some dodgy claims companies were getting involved after the event. And encouraging claims that should never have been made. So this added to HMRC's work. So they've decided to abolish it from, I think it's the 1st of June.
Yeah.
And just a couple of things about that. I wonder whether it'll actually get abolished. And I wonder that because there is the possibility of a general election being called in May. And if that was the case, then the abolition, and there were to be a sort of truncated finance bill quickly rushed through, it may be that the abolition was not included. And secondly, I imagine there'll be quite a few backbenchers on the government side who will be pushing back against this abolition, because a lot of their natural supporters like to take advantage of stamp duty exemptions, particularly with granny annexes. So I would expect some pushback.
Do you think they were a bit hasty in just abolishing it, and as opposed to maybe just redrafting some of the clauses?
Well, exactly. It could have been a targeted measure.
Yeah.
That, you know, they say it was intended to encourage property development, investment in flats and multiple dwellings. Well, why not confine it to institutional investors then, rather than just abolish it completely?
Yeah, I know from memory, it took HMRC a number of years to finally filter out all the abuse of subsale relief. They attempted to do it 1 year, they got round next year and so on, but eventually they did redraft it correctly, and it was pretty much quite tight.
Yeah, well, exactly. And the abolition, the transitional provisions, the cutoff is 6th of March. But if you've signed a contract on or before 6th of March, it doesn't matter when you complete, as long as you don't subsell or substantially alter innovate the contract. Now we've got, so anyone with a transaction that contracted before 6th of March will be able to claim it. And that includes transactions going back 12 months, where people want to make refund claims by amending their return. So I think we'll continue to see quite a few MDR claims for the rest of the year for historic contracts. And no doubt the claims companies will redouble their efforts to identify potential transactions benefiting from MDR and encourage the purchasers to apply. So it's far from dead as yet.
So with the reclaimed companies, obviously you've got your 12 months anyway to amend, but that will then go up to and include the 1st of June, won't it? So 2024. So you can go back a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, as long as you qualified for it, but you have to have had a contract in existence on or before 6th of March.
Yeah.
So if you contract after 6th of March, as long as you complete or substantially perform by 1st of June, then you're okay. Yeah. Now, in terms of the claims for MDR that have been made in the appeals in the pipeline, there are several appeals in the pipeline revolving around various issues to do with kitchens and privacy. And I'm noticing in the inquiries I'm asked to look at and the appeals that I'm asked to prepare, although HMRC say that they have a multifactorial approach to MDR, increasingly they seem to be focusing on single issues that are negative and saying, well, that disqualifies you, instead of taking a multifactorial approach. And they seem to be increasingly focusing on privacy, because 1 or 2 appeal decisions have said, well, it would be unacceptable for the occupants of the annex to share the garden and grounds with the occupants of the main dwelling, because it would be an unacceptable impingement on the privacy of the occupants of the main dwelling. And HMRC do increasingly run that in tribunal appeals, even where you've got annexes that are physically separate from the main dwelling.
That's quite interesting, actually, because I was reading the Bonsu judgment that you were part of, and obviously, clearly, there. I mean, there was an easement over the communal grounds, but you would have, if you had a block of flats that has communal grounds, you would have that situation arising in any event, wouldn't you?
You would, and this is one of the paradoxes of the HMRC approach, is that where you have a substantial dwelling with an annex in the ground, say a cottage, they raise objections based on communal use of the garden and access to the garage, across the driveway, etc., for the occupants of the annex. But that ignores the issue when you have blocks of flats where you have communal gardens, common parts. And they seem to try and resolve that by saying, well, a block of flats is different from a a dwelling with a cottage, and you approach it from a different perspective. But it is an inconsistent application of the privacy principle.
Yeah.
Now, another interesting area in multiple dwellings relief is the approach to buildings that are in the process of construction or adaptation. As you know, under the relevant deeming provision in paragraph 7.2b of Schedule 6b, when you have multiple dwellings, typically flats, that are in the process of construction or adaptation to become flats or dwellings, then they are deemed to be dwellings, effectively completed dwellings for the purpose of multiple dwellings relief, and you can apply for the relief on your purchase. And Ladson Preston, of course, and AKA developments in the upper tribunal confirmed that as far as the process of construction goes, there must be some physical construction in progress at the actual time of completion on the day.
Yeah.
And that's more than just, say, planning permission or the digging of boreholes or demolition. There has to be some physical manifestation of the construction, the new building in progress, for you to get a deemed dwelling for MDR purposes. And that's now fairly well known and understood, although the upper tribunal did say, very importantly, that they weren't going to try and describe a general rule for what constitutes the physical process of construction. And they expressly said, we're going to leave it to future first-tier tax tribunals to decide what that means in the context of the facts of each case. So there's still plenty of scope for appeals around what constitutes the physical process of construction. And there's one sticking point will be whether foundations that are not yet proud of the surface, will they constitute physical construction, or do you have to be proud of the surface, the so-called muddy brick versus golden brick scenario for VAT? Yeah. That remains to be decided. And I think there's published guidance from HMRC saying you need to be above ground for this purpose.
Yeah.
And the other interesting area, which just cropped up 2 weeks ago, was the process of adaptation. I defended a strikeout application by HMRC in a case called USAN Limited. And that was an in-person hearing 2 weeks ago in Taylor House in London, where the issue surrounded an office building in Peterborough that had been purchased for 6.7 million and was being adapted for use as flats. It had been converted into flats, and the developer claimed multiple dwellings relief on the purchase, on the basis that works had started on the day of purchase to adapt the building into flats. And HMRC said, well, this is just the same as Ladson Preston. So the process of construction hadn't physically started at completion. So you've got no hope of succeeding on appeal. So we'd like the tribunal to strike out your appeal. So the judge refused to strike out the appeal on the basis that Ladson Preston dealt with the construction of a new building. And here we had an existing building in situ that was being adapted. So that was different from Ladson Preston, where I think in AKA, the existing warehouses were being knocked down and then a new physical building would be constructed. So that was enough to differentiate the Newson case from Ladson Preston. And there was also the issue procedurally in a strikeout application, it's not a mini trial of the appeal. The person applying for a strikeout has to show essentially a very solid case for the strikeout, and that the appellant has no prospects of succeeding, no realistic prospect of succeeding in the appeal. And we said, well, although the work started on the day of completion, there's not yet any evidence before the tribunal as to when on the day those works started. And it's not unknown for developers to have a license to go in on the day, but before completion, and commence work before the actual moment of completion on the day. And as we know from Ladson Preston, it's the precise time on the day of completion that counts. If works start before that precise time, then you have a building in the process of being constructed or adapted. And the judge quite rightly said, well, look, there's no evidence before me to show when those works started. So it may well be that they did start on the morning of completion, and in which case that might qualify them for having started the physical work of adaptation. So all in all, the strikeout was refused, but that does show us that there's a separate category of deemed dwellings to be litigated. The building is not in the process of construction, but it's in an existing building is in the process of adaptation. So there'll be more appeals along those lines, including the USAN case when we get to a full hearing.
Just on that point, with regards to in the process of adaptation, obviously the conversion from the commercial into the flats, each of those separate dwellings, were they capable of being separate dwellings?
I think in USAN, the work had basically consisted of stripping out.
Because often with an MDR claim, one of the things that you're looking for is that the annex or the separate building is actually capable of effectively almost being sold as an individual property, or it has the kitchen, it has a functioning kitchen, has a bathroom, etc. So just on that point, again, that seems a bit of an anomaly that an MDR claim wouldn't work in those circumstances, but with the USAG claim, none of those, that was a commercial building that was going to be converted into flats. None of those were actually functioning flats at the time that the application was made.
Yes, we're relying on 7.2b, which, as long as the process is physically started, those are deemed to be dwellings, even though they're not yet being completed or substantially completed.
Right.
Yeah.
So with provided somebody can demonstrate the work's already started on a granny annex, then that could be a dwelling. That could be a separate dwelling.
Yes,
flats.
this is an underutilized scenario for the relief, although I do see taxpayers from time to time who are purchasing. And in fact, I've got one at the moment. Someone is buying a dwelling from a builder, and they're aware of MDR, and there's a suitable part of the dwelling that could be adapted for use as a granny annex. And the builder, the vendor, has agreed, he's done a deal with the purchaser to commence work on the building the annex.
Right.
And the idea is that at the point of purchase, the purchaser will say, well, there's a dwelling in the process of being constructed or adapted. And that'll be continued by the purchaser afterwards. And a claim will be made at completion, actually, in the return on the basis of 7.2b of Schedule 6b.
How would you quantify that it's been adapted? I mean, is there a tipping point for proof?
Well, that's a matter of fact. And Ladson Preston and AKA Developments tell us that in the case of construction, let's say you were constructing a cottage in the grounds, the process of building it would have to be physically started.
Yeah.
So to be safe, you put the foundations up above ground, and then you should have sufficient physical manifestation of the building to base a claim for MDR. So it's not just completed annexes or cottages that qualify.
Okay. So if you were, say, adapting a commercial premises into apartments, at which point would you say the adaptation started? When you rip it all out, start knocking walls through, or is it something as simple as that?
Yes. Well, ultimately, it's for the tribunal hearing the case on the facts. But I would think that as things currently stand, if the process is started before the actual time of completion on the day, stripping out and doing as much as you can towards preparing the building for the intended flats, then you should have something that is sufficiently in the process of adaptation. You've already got your physical building, which is very helpful. And as long as you started some substantial work towards that adaptation of the building into flats, there are probably myriad ways in which you could do that. But in New Sand, it was basically the stripping out of the building had commenced.
That's what, of course, you will have anyway. You'll have some building plans anyway, which of course will dictate what you do in the first place. So I suppose you have something there to support the fact that you are knocking down walls or, like you say, creating apartments or flats. Yes,
it's obviously very helpful when presenting the evidence to the FTT if you've got planning permission or permitted development consent and plans and funding to develop, so that it is a serious development, a serious adaptation into flats. It's not just something that the tribunal might think is just a try-on, and we're not going to end up with flats. We'll just end up with a
It's just Joe Bloggs with a sledgehammer going around knocking walls down.
Yeah. So the more evidence you can bring to bear, the better, and witness statements and so on. The other area of MDR, which is interesting, is in terms of completed annexes and outbuildings, etc., as dwellings, is the contrast between the approach to suitability for use as a dwelling and the approach of the tribunals in relation to the same wording in the context of uninhabitable dwellings. Because there's a tremendous inconsistency between the two. You've got, in MDR, you've got the Fiander and Brower approach, where you recall there was a bungalow that some years ago had been joined to the main dwelling with a brick hallway constructed between the bungalow and the main dwelling. And then the interconnecting door had been taken out of its hinges to create effectively a walk-through. So the bungalow was used with the main dwelling. And the argument for MDR, and I think this was the first MDR case to come before the tribunal, the argument for MDR was that the bungalow was still suitable for use as a single separate dwelling, because all you had to do was to re-hang the door in the door jambs. And so with that very minor modification or addition, you had something that was suitable for use as a dwelling. But the first-tier tribunal, as supported by the upper tribunal, said you have to effectively, you judge suitability at the precise moment of completion. And as there was no door hanging in the hinges at that point, you couldn't treat that as suitable for use as a single separate dwelling by the addition of rehanging the door, because that wasn't the test. But when you come to uninhabitable dwellings and claims for uninhabitable dwellings, you're looking at the virtually identical wording for suitability in section 116(1)(a) of the Finance Act 2003. And we're told that there, in that context, something that has been used as a dwelling in the past remains suitable for use as a dwelling if it can be, in the words of the judge in Mudan, if it can be fixed up. And it can only not be fixed up if it's radioactive or it's in a state of collapse. Anything else means it is suitable for use as a dwelling because it can be fixed up.
I think as well that massively highlights why you have the claims companies that spring up, and you have solicitors that wash their hands of obviously given the tax advice, and you have estate agents trying to sell properties and telling sort of clients that they could, claim this additional relief to enable them to sell properties. Because when you have such a huge inconsistency in the same words, really, for a claim for SDLT relief, I think that it's not surprising, really, that people don't really want to touch it with a barge pole, and it gets so complicated, so unnecessarily complicated.
That's absolutely right. And although Medan is subject to an appeal before the upper tribunal, I think in June, we're going to the upper tribunal to appeal it. If the Medan approach is confirmed, then it's going to be extremely difficult to argue that any building that has been used as a dwelling in the past, or at least in the recent past, is uninhabitable, no matter what its state is, except for radioactivity or in a state of collapse. And the facts in Medan were interesting because they brought that into stark relief, because we had an electrician's report that was quite genuine. It was commissioned around the time of the acquisition of the building, which said this property is too dangerous to live in. It needs a complete new set of electrics and wiring. Do not go in there. This was a family with children who'd bought. And this point so worried HMRC on the day of the hearing that they made an application set you without notice to exclude the electrician's report from the hearing on the basis that it was really an expert report and we hadn't got directions for expert evidence. Now, the judge refused that, of course. It was a bit of an ambush. But the judge went on to say, well, dodgy electrics that mean it's too dangerous to live there doesn't affect suitability for use as a dwelling. So it is a minefield. And the scope that this has given dodgy claims companies to get involved has gone down a rather dark path, because there are now criminal investigations into some of these companies and unfortunately some of their customers as well. There were 2 or 3 companies under investigation by the Fraud Investigation Service at HMRC. One company was making on average of over 300 claims a month.
Wow.
And I was instructed to act for customers of another claims company under investigation, and they were told that they were suspected of fraud and invited to interviews under caution down at Westfield at HMRC's office in Stratford. So they asked me to accompany them, and I went down with them. And we had the interviews. And I'm pleased to say that a little while after those interviews, they received letters saying they were no longer under suspicion, because they had, I better not get into too much detail, but essentially they were not dishonest. And they'd been led down the path by the claims company concerned. So there's that going on. There's, of course, the abolition of MTR from the 1st of June. And so it all got rather heated. And the result of these criminal investigations will be known in due course. And there may be prosecutions. Oh, I was just going to mention a case that I had in relation to uninhabitable dwellings. It was rather ironic. Last year, I was asked to give an opinion on whether a claim for an uninhabitable dwelling could be made by a client who approached me directly. And I looked at their case and I said, no, it's basically a few tiles missing on the roof, a few other repairs, but your building's not uninhabitable. And in fact, people were living there up until the time you bought the dwelling. So you can't really go to HMRC and say you bought an uninhabitable dwelling. So that was fine. Then a few weeks later, my clerk got a very angry email from the same client saying, wanting me to pay them, I forget, £14,000, £20,000. And the reasoning was that they had approached one of these claims companies after I had advised them they didn't have a case. And the claims company, of course, had said, yes, of course you can claim, we'll make the claim. So they made the claim, and under HMRC's process now, pay now, check later, they got back a refund check for a huge amount of money. But the claims company had taken its commission of whatever it was, 14,000. And so the logic was that I had cost this client 14,000 quid because he had to pay the commission in order to get his refund when I told him he couldn't get a refund.
Yeah. So
he was very angry. But we said, well, look, you might have a problem here. It takes HMRC 7 or 8 months to get round to checking. So would you kindly hold fire until you know you're in the clear after the 9-month inquiry period? And we haven't had a peep out of him since. And I happen to know that the claims company that made his claim is under criminal investigation. And I did see that their instructions to their claims handlers was, do not ask clients for evidence of the uninhabitable dwelling. You must take them on trust. So there you go. That's how they operate.
Crazy.
Obviously, I've not mentioned any names because I don't want to undermine any investigation that's going on. But that gives you quite a strong flavour position regarding uninhabitable dwellings at the moment. So I just thought we'd probably round this off with a few words about mixed use claims.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Because, of course, mixed use claims have survived the budget announcements. They're not going to do anything about them, which is kind of surprising in a way. I did have a quick look at the press release, and I think they canvassed various approaches, but I believe they've decided to stay with the same all or nothing approach to mixed use. So the action at the moment in mixed use claims seems to be around the functional use test versus the commercial use test. And what I mean by that is there are sort of conflicting decisions on the meaning of grounds of the dwelling. As you know, Section 116 includes within the term residential property land that is the garden or grounds of the dwelling, with the emphasis on the word of. And that tells us, I think, that the land acquired with the dwelling has to be the grounds of the dwelling. So other land acquired at the same time that are not grounds of the dwelling will not be residential property. And so you get your mixed use claim. The decisions at the moment, there's some tension between, in order to take land acquired with the dwelling out of the definition of residential, whether you require a positive non-residential use of that other land, most typically commercial, or a more passive test consisting of whether the additional land in question performs any function in relation to the dwelling. So by that I mean, with the latter test, you could take land, say you acquire 70, 80 acres, and 10 acres are behind a hillside and a wood and are not used by the occupiers of the dwelling for any purpose, and perform effectively no function for the dwelling or its occupier. Is the test sufficient to say that is not of any functional use, and therefore does not form part of the grounds of the dwelling, so you have a mixed use acquisition? Or does that land require some positive commercial use in order to take it out of the grounds of the dwelling? So at the moment in the cases, there's a tension between the two approaches.
So whether you're sort of renting it out to a farmer, or there's a license in place, a tenancy, it's something formalised.
Yes, ideally formalised, so you have a written agreement of commercial rent with a third party.
Yeah.
For the commercial use of the land. That's the ideal situation. Or whether you can say, well, there's no commercial use of that land, but it doesn't provide any privacy or security or a treasured view, for instance, or any recreational use for the occupiers, because it's over the hill and behind the woodland.
Yeah.
And is that enough to take it out of residential use? So we'll get clarity on that, I think, with a few cases that are coming up to the tribunal. But at the moment, if you are buying a dwelling with lots of land, ideally you will have commercial arrangements for 1 or 2 paddocks with a neighbouring farmer in writing at a commercial rent that were in place prior to the sale and continue in place after the sale.
Yeah.
And again, there's another issue between whether you need to have sheep or horses grazing or some other active husbandry on the land with animals, or whether cropping is sufficient. I did a case in Manchester, actually in January, where we're still waiting on the decision, and the commercial use there was the cropping of grass by a local contractor for mowing once or twice a year, and then for use as bales of hay or whatever.
Yeah.
And HMRC's approach to that essentially was, well, that wasn't all year-round commercial use because it was only mown once or twice a year. And I remember in the witness box, the owner of the land, who was a former farmer, getting quite irritated and saying, well, the grass has to grow all year round,
yeah,
in order for it to be ready for cutting once or twice a year. So that those sort of issues at the moment. And finally, some judges have hinted or actually said that the functional use test, where the additional land is passive but performs no positive function in relation to the dwelling, they say to me, Mr. Cannon, isn't that really a reasonable enjoyment test? Which we know we can't apply since Hyman and Goodfellow. And having thought about that, I think it is different from the functional use test. The reasonable enjoyment test looks at land that would ordinarily be within the scope of garden and grounds, and says that part of that land not necessary for the reasonable enjoyment of the dwelling. So that's a much stricter test, because you buy 20 acres and you have horses and you only need 7 acres for the horses. Then under the reasonable enjoyment test, you'd say, well, those 13 acres are not necessary. And indeed, the use by equine people may not be reasonably required for the enjoyment of the dwelling in any event. But that's a much stricter test than the functional use test that says, well, those additional 13 acres, they're over the hill far away behind a woodland, and they're not used for recreation or any other purposes to do with the dwelling. That's a wider test, it seems to me, than the reasonable enjoyment test. So it's a more fundamental test. So I think there is a difference between the reasonable enjoyment test and the functional use test. And of course, we have a number of appeals coming up. One in April, the Sudawalla decision that held that a paddock adjacent to a dwelling on a 5-acre plot that was grazed under an agreement that had entered into immediately after completion, where Judge Rank had held that was not residential property. That is under appeal, and we have the appeal on that by HMRC the end of April. So that should provide quite a lot of guidance for it.
What's your experience and view on the clawback period? So obviously, once you've claimed a relief, HMRC have got 3 years. So with these mixed use, for example, if at the time of completion there is a formalised agreement in place, that there is a sense of commerciality about it, whether that's grazing for horses or sheep or whatever, but that doesn't continue. So how would a client feel if they then subsequently and quite reasonably decided that they no longer wish to renew a license or a tenancy? What's their exposure then to HMRC just saying, well, we are now, that's not a continuing, that as that's not continuing, the commercial aspect that you've claimed is no longer appropriate or valid?
Well, I think this goes essentially to the commerciality of the use that was occurring at completion. And if it ends shortly afterwards, then you're open to the accusation that it was just window dressing.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really commercial because you didn't keep it in place. So as a practical matter, I would advise clients that you should keep the commercial use going for at least the inquiry period.
Yeah.
So that with hindsight, if you end up in the tribunal 2 years later, you've got the commercial use still continuing, and that will impress the tribunal.
Yeah.
If you end it, within a few months after completion, the judge might be rather skeptical about.
Sure. Because I think, people's circumstances do change. And because we live in quite a cynical world now, because HMRC are pushing back heavily, and obviously, as we've discussed earlier on in the conversation about, what they consider to be a dwelling on the one hand isn't the same as what they consider to be a dwelling on the other hand. So there's always going to be opportunities for people to make money or people to reduce their tax bills, but similarly, there's always going to be ways that HMRC are going to come back at you. So I think that just in terms of life changes, and life does change. You could have reasonably bought a property with an annex, anticipating housing and a relative for a period of time, and then they pass away, and you decide to incorporate that back into your home. so circumstances do change for people, but invariably after the 9 months, it's unlikely that HMRC will continue to look at it, do you think? Or that's just, that's always a possibility. Because another thing with MDR we were finding was that local authorities were getting in touch with clients and saying, well, if you've claimed MDR, we're now going to, obviously levy the appropriate amounts of tax on that property.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is also obviously an interesting concept.
Yes, well, there's two points there. The 3-year control period applies for MDR. And HMRC now operate a system. They diarise people who've claimed MDR, and you'll get a letter 3 years after completion asking you to confirm that the number of dwellings is still the same.
Right.
And obviously you need to reply to that saying with truthfully. So they are checking up on the control period. And in relation to the council tax point, there's recently been an appeal, like an unsuccessful appeal, I forget the name of it. There's a taxpayer in person in the last month or so who seems to have got confused and thought that because they were separately rated for council tax, that automatically meant they should get MDR. But of course, as the tribunal pointed out, the definitions of accommodation are different for council tax and MDR. And if I remember correctly, council tax works off what's called a unit of accommodation, whereas MDR is a lot higher threshold. And you have to have all the facilities necessary for a separate private domestic existence. So for instance, in practice, you can get a council tax assessment for a unit of accommodation, say, that is at the top of a staircase, but without a lockable internal connecting door.
Yeah.
With an MDR claim for that accommodation, even though you're assessed for council tax, would fail. Because you haven't got a lockable internal connecting door. So I guess what that means is that where you do have a successful MDR dwelling claim, you'll almost certainly have a council tax vulnerability, because you would almost certainly be a unit of accommodation for council tax.
Yeah.
And that is one of the drawbacks of claiming MDR increasingly as councils get wise to this. Although how council would know that you've made a claim for MDR, I'm not sure, because your tax affairs are meant to be private. So unless the council has some way of liaising with HMRC that I'm not aware of, they shouldn't really be aware. But I'm not sure what the obligation is to report to the council that you have a separate unit accommodation that should be assessed. I think at the moment it just goes by the by.
Yes.
And if they find out, then they assess you. It's not got to the stage where they come down on you like a ton of bricks and start charging penalties or anything like that. But you're right, there is a crossover. And if you do have a single separate dwelling for MDR, then you're almost certainly vulnerable to a council tax.
Yeah.
Although some councils offer a discount, for example, 50%, where the accommodation is used with the main dwelling.
Right.
But again, that might undermine an MDR
Scupper
claim.
your MDR claim.
Yeah. If you argue that it's really only suitable for use as part of the main dwelling, which HMRC like to argue in MDR claims with granny annexes. They say, well, it might have lots of different facilities for a single separate dwelling, but it is eminently suitable for use with the main dwelling, and therefore shouldn't be classed as a single separate dwelling. And that's succeeded in a number of cases that I've taken on appeal to the tribunal.
Yes, because are they also looking to see whether it's separately saleable? Are they also arguing the point?
They are in some cases. Yes, some judges have taken that point. Could you sell off the annex separately? Well, in most cases, no, you couldn't. And
Mm.
indeed, there are often planning restrictions preventing you from doing that.
Yeah.
So if you really go into MDR in very objectively and on a strict basis, you come down to issues like Judge Poon said in one case, well, there aren't separate rubbish collection bins. And that would be an impingement on the privacy of the occupiers of the main dwelling. It cause all sorts of confusion. So it's how far do you drill down into the requirements for a single separate dwelling?
Yeah. Wow. Fascinating stuff. Good stuff. So we'll need to watch this space, and if there's a general election called in May, the abolition of MDR could be vulnerable.
It could be, if they don't have time to squeeze it into a truncated finance bill.
Yeah.
But it is essentially, the abolition is a tax rise. It's a very stealthy tax rise.
Yeah.
It's worse than just keeping the income tax higher rate thresholds the same and drawing lots and lots of people into higher rates of tax. It's the abolition of a relief that a lot of ordinary people were.
Been using. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm really grateful for your time today. So thank you very much. And I shall follow your the judgments anyway with added interest, and get you back on when we need an update.
All right. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks ever so much, Patrick.
Thanks for listening, and tune in next time when we discuss more of the tax and legal issues surrounding your business and property needs.